She saved a cowboy from danger. Days later, his gang protected her. The sun hung low over the jagged horizon of Dustwater Valley, painting the sky in hues of amber and crimson, as if the heavens themselves were blushing at the raw beauty of the untamed West. The air carried the scent of sagebrush and the faint tang of iron from the red earth, stirred by a restless wind that whispered secrets through the sparse grasses. In the heart of this rugged land where life clung stubbornly to every crack and crevice, a young woman named Clara Mae Johnson rode alone. Her horse, a sturdy bay mare named Juniper, picked its way carefully along a rocky trail that snaked through the valley. Clara's brown hair, tied loosely with a leather thong, swayed with the rhythm of her mount, and her eyes, deep and expressive, like pools catching the last light of day, scanned the landscape with a quiet intensity. Clara was no stranger to these wilds. Born and raised on a modest homestead at the edge of Dustwater, she learned early how to read the land to sense its moods and dangers. Her father, a weathered rancher, had taught her to ride before she could read, and her mother, a woman of gentle strength, had instilled in her a heart that refused to turn away from those in need. At 22, Clara was a blend of grit and grace, her hands calloused from work, her spirit unyielding yet kind. She wasn't one for fancy dresses or town gossip. Her world was the open range where survival demanded both courage and compassion. As she guided Juniper along the trail, her thoughts were on the chores awaiting her back home, mending a fence, tending to the chickens, and checking the water pump that had been acting fickle. The day had been long, and the weight of responsibility pressed on her shoulders. Her family's homestead was small, just enough to sustain them, but it was hers to protect now, with her father gone and her mother growing frail. The thought of her mother's tired smile spurred her to nudge Juniper a little faster, eager to return before dark. But then a sound cut through the stillness, a sharp, pained cry, human and raw, echoing from a gully just beyond the trail. Clara reined in Juniper, her heart quickening. She listened, her breath catching as the cry came again, weaker this time, tinged with desperation. Without hesitation, she dismounted, tying Juniper to a scraggly mesquite tree. Her boots crunched on the dry earth as she followed the sound, her hand resting lightly on the knife sheathed at her hip. The West was no place for the careless, and Clara knew better than to rush blindly into trouble. Yet something in that cry tugged at her, a plea she couldn't ignore. The gully was steep, its sides littered with loose stones and gnarled roots. At its bottom, sprawled in the dirt, was a man. His hat lay crumpled a few feet away, and his clothes, dusty denim and a faded plaid shirt, were torn and streaked with blood. A heavy log, likely dislodged from the gully's edge, pinned his leg, and his face was pale sweat beading on his brow. He was young, perhaps a few years older than Clara, with dark hair plastered to his forehead and a jawline sharp enough to cut through the tension in the air. His eyes, a striking gray, met hers as she approached, and though pain clouded them, there was a flicker of defiance, as if he refused to let the land claim him. "Hold still," Clara said, her voice steady, despite the urgency thrumming in her chest. She knelt beside him, assessing the situation. The log was heavy, its weight pressing cruelly into his leg, and a jagged wound above his knee bled steadily. He'd been here a while, she guessed, judging by the way the blood had begun to dry at the edges. "What's your name, Jeremiah?" He rasped, his voice rough but clear. "Jeremiah Slade. Most call me Jem." He tried to shift, wincing as the movement jarred the log. "You don't need to bother, miss. I'll figure a way out." Clara raised an eyebrow, unimpressed by his bravado. "You'll bleed out before you do." "Now hush and let me work." She didn't wait for his reply, already scanning the gully for something to use as leverage. A sturdy branch lay nearby, and she grabbed it, testing its strength. "This is gonna hurt, Jem, but I'll get you free." Jem's eyes narrowed, studying her as if trying to decide whether she was a fool or a saint. "You always this bossy with strangers? Only the ones dumb enough to get stuck under a log?" She shot back, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. She wedged the branch under the log using a rock as a fulcrum and leaned her weight into it. The wood groaned, and Jem bit back a grunt of pain as the pressure on his legs shifted. Clara's muscles strained her breath, coming in sharp bursts, but she didn't falter. With a final heave, the log rolled free, tumbling down the gully with a dull thud. Jem gasped, clutching his leg, but relief flooded his face. Clara knelt again, tearing a strip from her own shirt to bind the wound. Her hands moved quickly, practiced from years of tending to her family's livestock and the occasional scraped knee. "You're lucky this didn't break your leg," she said, tying the makeshift bandage tight. "Can you stand?" He tested his weight, grimacing, but managing to get to his feet with her help. "I owe you," he said, his voice softer now, almost grudging. "Didn't expect anyone out here, let alone someone like you." Clara shrugged, brushing dirt from her hands. "Don't make a habit of needing rescue, Cowboy. I've got enough work as it is." She helped him limp up the gully, her arms steady under his. His weight leaned heavily on her, but she bore it without complaint, guiding him to where Juniper waited. His own horse, a sleek black stallion, stood nearby, grazing calmly, as if nothing had happened. As they reached the trail, Jem glanced at her, his gray eyes searching. "You got a name, or do you just go around saving folks for fun?" "Clara Mae Johnson," she said simply, checking Juniper's reins. "And I don't make a habit of it either. You heading to town?" He shook his head, a shadow passing over his face. "Not yet. Got business out here first." There was something in his tone, guarded, almost wary, that made Clara pause, but she didn't press. The West was full of men with secrets, and she wasn't one to pry. "Get that leg looked at," she said instead, swinging up onto Juniper, "and stay out of gullies." Jem's lips twitched the ghost of a smile. "Yes, ma'am." He tipped his hat, retrieved from the dirt, and watched as she rode off, the fading light catching the determined set of her shoulders. Clara didn't look back, but she felt his gaze linger, a weight as tangible as the dust on her boots. She didn't know it then, but that moment in the gully had set something in motion, a spark struck in the dry tinder of the Wild West, where kindness could be as dangerous as a loaded gun. 3 days later, that spark would flare into something neither she nor Jem could have foreseen, pulling them into a storm of loyalty, danger, and an unexpected bond that would defy the harsh rules of the frontier. As she rode toward home, the wind carried the distant howl of a coyote, a reminder that the West was never truly safe. But Clara Mae Johnson was no stranger to its challenges, and she carried on unaware that fate was already weaving a new thread into her story, one that would test her courage and change her life forever. The twilight deepened over Dustwater Valley as Clara Mae Johnson guided Juniper toward home, the last embers of sunset fading into a star-pricked sky. The encounter with Jeremiah Slade lingered in her mind, his gray eyes and stubborn grit an unwelcome distraction from the practical concerns of her homestead. She shook her head as if to dislodge the thought and focused on the familiar rhythm of Juniper's hooves against the earth. The night was cool, the air sharp with the promise of a restless wind, and Clara's thoughts turned to the warmth of her mother's kitchen, where a pot of stew might still be simmering. But beneath her calm exterior, a flicker of unease stirred, not about Jem, but about the land itself, which always seemed to hold its breath before trouble came calling. Back at the homestead, a modest cabin nestled against a low rise, Clara found her mother Eliza sitting by the fire, her frail hands busy with mending. The glow of the flames softened the lines on Eliza's face, but her eyes, much like Clara's, held a quiet strength. "You're late," Eliza said, her voice gentle but laced with worry. "Trouble on the road." Clara hesitated, then recounted the gully rescue, keeping her tone light to ease her mother's concern. She mentioned Jem only in passing, describing him as a stranger, caught in a bad spot, but Eliza's gaze sharpened, catching the unspoken weight in her daughter's words. "You be careful, Clara Mae," she said, setting aside her needlework. "Kindness is a rare coin out here, but it can buy trouble as quick as it buys friends." Clara nodded, brushing off the warning with a smile, but her mother's words clung to her as she tended to the evening chores. The homestead was a fragile thing, a patch of order carved from the wild. The fence needed patching, the barn's roof leaked, and the specter of drought loomed like a vulture circling overhead. Clara's father had built this place with dreams of permanence, but his death 2 winters ago had left it to her to hold together. She worked tirelessly, her hands steady and her heart resolute, but the weight of it all sometimes felt like a yoke too heavy for one pair of shoulders. The next morning dawned bright, the sun a fierce eye glaring down on Dustwater Valley. Clara rose early, her body aching from the previous day's exertions, and set out to check the water pump at the edge of their land. It was a temperamental contraption prone to clogging, and without it their crops would wither. As she knelt by the pump, coaxing it with a wrench and a few choice words, she heard the distant thunder of hooves, a sound that sent a prickle down her spine. She stood shielding her eyes against the sun and saw a group of riders approaching, their silhouettes dark against the golden haze. There were 4 of them, their horses kicking up clouds of dust as they rode with purpose toward the homestead. Clara's heart quickened, but she kept her stance steady, her hand resting lightly on the knife at her hip. Strangers in these parts could mean anything from traders to trouble, and the way these men sat, their saddles loose, confident with hands near their holsters, suggested the latter. As they drew closer, she noted their rough attire, weathered hats, bandanas tied loose, and eyes that scanned the land like predators sizing up prey. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a scar snaking across his cheek, reined in his horse a few yards from Clara. His smile was all teeth, no warmth. "Morning, miss," he said, his voice smooth as snake oil. "Name's Caleb Rourke. We're just passing through looking for a friend of ours. Goes by Jem Slade." You seen him. Clara's stomach tightened at the mention of Jem's name, but her face gave nothing away. She'd learned long ago that the West rewarded those who could keep their cards close. "Can't say I have," she replied, her tone even. "Folks come and go out here. What's he to you?" Rourke's smile didn't waver, but his eyes narrowed, studying her like a hawk eyeing a rabbit. "Just an old friend we're keen to catch up with. Heard he was in these parts, maybe hurt. Thought a kind soul like yourself might have crossed paths." Clara held his gaze, her pulse steady, despite the tension coiling in her chest. "If he's hurt, he's likely holed up somewhere, not wandering. You're welcome to water your horses, but there's nothing here for you." She gestured toward the pump, her movements deliberate, non-threatening, but her eyes never left Artugjung's. The other riders exchanged glances, their hands twitching near their guns. One of them, a wiry man with a patchy beard, leaned forward, his voice low and mocking. "Pretty thing, like you all alone out here. Reckon you'd remember a man like Jem if you saw him." Clara's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice calm. "I remember what matters. And right now what matters is you're on my land. Water your horses and move on." Rourke chuckled, a sound that grated like gravel underfoot. "Feisty, ain't you? We'll be on our way, miss, but we'll be back. Jem's got debts to settle, and we ain't the patient sort." He tipped his hat, a mockery of courtesy, and signaled his men to move out. They rode off, leaving a trail of dust and unease in their wake. Clara watched them until they were specks on the horizon, her mind racing. Jem Slade wasn't just some cowboy caught in a bad spot. He was trouble, the kind that drew men like Rourke like flies to a carcass. She didn't know what debts Jem carried, but she knew enough of the West to understand that men like Rourke didn't chase ghosts. Whatever Jem was running from, it was big, and now it was circling her home. She returned to the pump, her hands moving mechanically as she finished the repair, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The memory of Jem's gray eyes, sharp with pain and defiance, flickered in her mind. She'd saved his life, and that act, however small it seemed, had tied her to him in ways she couldn't yet fathom. The West had a way of weaving lives together, stitching them tight with threads of chance and consequence. As the day wore on, Clara kept busy hauling water, checking the livestock and reinforcing the fence. But the air felt heavier now, charged with the promise of something coming, something she couldn't outrun. By evening, as she sat with her mother over a simple meal of cornbread and beans, the weight of Rourke's visit pressed on her. She didn't mention it to Eliza, not wanting to add to her mother's worries, but the silence between them was thick with unspoken questions. That night, as Clara lay in her narrow bed, the wind howled outside, rattling the shutters. She stared at the ceiling, her mind tracing back to the gully, to Jem's voice, rough and grateful, and to the riders who'd come looking for him. She didn't know where Jem was now or what he'd done to earn such enemies, but she felt the pull of something larger than herself, a story unfolding, one where her act of kindness was only the beginning. Unbeknownst to her, miles away, Jem Slade sat by a low fire, his leg bandaged but still throbbing, his thoughts on the woman who'd pulled him from death's grip. He didn't know her well, but he knew enough to recognize courage when he saw it. And as he cleaned his revolver, the weight of his own secrets heavy in his hands, he made a silent vow: if trouble came for Clara, Mae Johnson, because of him, he'd be there to face it. The West was a hard place, but it was also a place where debts of the heart were paid in full, no matter the cost. The wind that had howled through Dustwater Valley the previous night had settled into an eerie stillness by dawn, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Clara Mae Johnson rose with the sun, her body moving through the familiar rhythm of chores, but her mind was a storm of questions. The memory of Caleb Rourke's cold smile and the menace in his rider's eyes clung to her like dust on her boots. She hadn't told her mother about the visitors, but the weight of their threat pressed against her chest, a silent warning that trouble was not just coming, it was already here. As she fed the chickens and checked the newly repaired pump, her gaze kept drifting to the horizon, half expecting to see those riders return, their shadows stretching long across the valley. By mid-morning, the heat was relentless, the sun scorching the earth until the air shimmered. Clara was hauling a bucket of water to the house when she heard it, a low, ominous rumble like distant thunder, but sharper, more deliberate. Hooves. Many hooves. Her heart lurched and she dropped the bucket, water sloshing over her boots as she sprinted to the porch. Her mother, Eliza, was already there, her frail frame tense as she clutched the door frame, her eyes fixed on the dust cloud rising in the distance. "Clara, get the rifle," Eliza said, her voice low but steady. There was no panic in her tone, only the quiet resolve of a woman who'd faced the West cruelties before. Clara didn't argue. She dashed inside, grabbing the old Winchester from above the fireplace, its weight familiar in her hands. Her father had taught her to shoot years ago, and though she'd never aimed at a man, she knew she could if it came to that. She stepped back onto the porch, standing shoulder to shoulder with her mother, the rifle resting against her hip as the riders came into view. There were more this time, 6 and maybe 7, their horses moving with a predatory grace. Caleb Rourke was at the front, his scar glinting in the sunlight, but there was something different about him now, a hunger in his posture that hadn't been there before. As they drew closer, Clara's stomach twisted. These weren't just men looking for Jem Slade. They were here for something else, something personal, something cruel. She could see it in the way Rourke's eyes swept over the homestead, lingering on the barn, the garden, the fragile life she and her mother had built. "Well, well," Miss Johnson, Rourke called out, reining in his horse just beyond the fence. His voice was smooth, but it carried an edge sharp enough to cut. "Told you we'd be back. Seems our friend Jem's been slipperier than we thought, but we figured you might know more than you let on." Clara's grip tightened on the rifle, but she kept it lowered, her voice calm, despite the fire in her chest. "I told you before, I don't know where your man is. You're wasting your time here, Rourke." He laughed, a cold grating sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "Oh, I don't think so. See, Jem's got something we want, a little matter of gold stolen from the wrong people. And word is he was mighty grateful to a certain lady who pulled him out of a ditch. Gratitude makes men talk, don't it?" Clara's mind raced. Gold Jem hadn't struck her as a thief, but the West was full of men with shadows in their pasts. Had her act of kindness tied her to a criminal? She pushed the thought aside. focusing on the moment. "You're barking up the wrong tree," she said, her eyes locked on Rourke's. "There's nothing here but a homestead and two women trying to live. You want gold, go dig for it elsewhere." Rourke's smile vanished, replaced by a scowl that made his scar twist like a snake. "You're a bold one, I'll give you that. But bold don't keep you safe." He nodded to his men who dismounted in unison, their boots thudding against the earth. One of them, the wiry man from before, pulled a coiled rope from his saddlebag, his grin promising trouble. Another drew a pistol, slow and deliberate, letting the metallic click echo in the tense air. Eliza stepped forward, her voice cutting through the silence. "You men think you can ride up and take what you want. This land's seen worse than you, and we're still here. Leave now, or you'll regret it." The threat hung in the air, fragile but fierce, and for a moment Rourke hesitated, his eyes flicking between Clara and her mother. Then he laughed again, colder this time, and raised a hand. "Search the place. Tear it apart if you have to. If she's hiding Jem, we'll find him." The men moved toward the house, their steps heavy with intent. Clara's heart pounded her finger, twitching near the rifle's trigger. She could take one, maybe two, before they overwhelmed her, but the odds were grim. She glanced at her mother, whose face was pale but unyielding, and felt a surge of protectiveness. This was their home, their life, and she'd be damned if she let these vultures take it. But before she could act, a new sound shattered the moment, a sharp crack like a whip snapping, followed by a shout. One of Rourke's men staggered, clutching his shoulder as blood bloomed through his shirt. The others spun, drawing their weapons as a hail of gunfire erupted from the rise behind the homestead. Clara's breath caught as she saw them, 5 riders, their horses charging down the slope, firing with deadly precision. The leader, his hat low and his coat billowing, was unmistakable Jeremiah Slade. Jem's gang hit like a thunderstorm, their bullets tearing through the air. Rourke's men scrambled for cover, but they were caught off guard, their confidence crumbling under the onslaught. One fell his horse, bolting in panic, while another returned fire only to be knocked from his saddle by a well-placed shot. Rourke cursed, yanking his horse around as he shouted orders, but his voice was drowned out by the chaos. Clara dropped to a crouch, pulling her mother behind the porch railing, the rifle still in her hands. Her eyes locked on Jem, who rode at the front, his face a mask of grim determination. His legs still bandaged didn't slow him as he leaped from his horse, landing with a roll and firing again. His men moved like a single unit. Their shots coordinated, their movements swift. They weren't just outlaws, they were a force disciplined and deadly. Rourke's gang was faltering, but he wasn't done. He drew a second pistol, aiming at Jem, who was now taking cover behind a stack of hay bales. "You think you can run forever?" Slade Rourke roared, his voice raw with fury. "That gold's ours, and we'll burn this place to the ground to get it." Clara's heart raced as she realized the truth. Jem hadn't just been running from Rourke. He'd been protecting something worth killing for. And now, because of her, that fight had come to her doorstep. She raised the rifle, her hands steady despite the chaos, and aimed at Rourke. But before she could pull the trigger, Jem's voice cut through the din. "Clara, stay down," he shouted, his eyes meeting hers for a fleeting moment. There was no time to argue. A bullet whizzed past, splintering the porch railing, and Clara ducked, her mother's hand gripping her arm. The fight was brutal, a whirlwind of gunfire and dust. Jem's gang fought with a ferocity that spoke of loyalty, not just to their leader, but to something deeper. One of them, a burly man with a red beard, took a bullet to the arm, but kept firing, his face set in a snarl. Another, younger with a quick grin, tossed a knife that caught one of Rourke's men in the thigh, sending him sprawling. Rourke, cornered but defiant, fired wildly, his men falling around him. Finally, with a curse, he mounted his horse and fled, 2 of his remaining men, following their retreat, a desperate scramble through the dust. The gunfire faded, leaving only the groans of the wounded and the heavy breathing of those still standing. Jem rose from behind the hay bales, his revolver still in hand, his eyes scanning the scene. His gang gathered around him, checking their wounds, their faces hard but triumphant. Clara stood, helping her mother to her feet, her rifle still clutched tightly. The homestead was battered, bullet holes pocked the barn, and the garden was trampled, but it stood. Jem approached, his limp more pronounced, now his face streaked with sweat and dust. "You all right?" he asked, his voice rough but laced with concern. Clara nodded, her throat tight. "You brought a war to my door, Jem Slade." He met her gaze unflinching. "And I'll end it, Clara. I owe you that much." She wanted to ask about the gold, about Rourke, about the men who'd fought for him, but the words caught in her throat. The air was thick with questions, and the answers she knew would only bring more danger. For now, she held his gaze, seeing not just the cowboy she'd saved, but a man carrying a burden heavier than any log in a gully. The dust settled over Dustwater Valley, clinging to the bullet-scarred homestead like a shroud, as the echoes of gunfire faded into the heavy afternoon air. Clara Mae Johnson stood on her porch, her mother's hand still gripping her arm, the Winchester rifle heavy in her other hand. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, stayed locked on Jeremiah Slade Jem as he limped toward her, his gray gaze carrying a weight that matched the chaos left in his wake. The homestead was still standing, but the garden was a trampled mess, the barn pocked with bullet holes and the air thick with the acrid scent of gunpowder. Jem's gang, a rough-looking crew of 5, gathered behind him, their faces a mix of exhaustion and wary triumph. The fight with Caleb Rourke's men had been fierce, but it was far from over, and Clara could feel the storm brewing anew. Jem stopped a few feet from the porch, his hat tilted back, revealing a sheen of sweat on his brow. "I didn't mean for this to come to your door, Clara," he said, his voice low, roughened by the fight and something deeper, guilt perhaps, or resolve. "But I'm here now, and I'll make it right." Clara's jaw tightened, her emotions, a tangled knot of gratitude and frustration. "Make it right," she said, her tone sharp enough to cut through the tension. "You've got a funny way of showing gratitude, cowboy. My garden's ruined, my barn's a sieve, and my mother's about to keel over from fright. You call this right?" Eliza, still clutching Clara's arm, gave a soft huff, her voice steadier than her frail frame suggested. "I'm not keeling over just yet, Clara May, but I'd like some answers, Mr. Slade, and quick." Jem's lips twitched, a flicker of amusement breaking through his grim expression, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "Fair enough, ma'am," he said, nodding to Eliza. "You've got every right to be sore, but Rourke's men, they're after more than just me. They're after something I swore to keep out of their hands." The gold, Clara said, her voice flat, though her heart raced at the word. She'd pieced it together from Rourke's taunts, but hearing it from Jem's mouth made it real, a glittering specter that had brought death to her doorstep. Jem's eyes met hers, steady but guarded. "Aye, the gold. Not what you're thinking, though. It ain't about greed, it's about blood." He paused, glancing at his men who shifted uncomfortably, their hands still near their weapons. "But this ain't the place to talk it out. We need to secure your homestead case. Rourke comes back with more." Clara wanted to press him to demand the full story, but the urgency in his voice and the sight of his wounded men stopped her. The burly, red-bearded man, who Jem called Red, was clutching his arm, blood seeping through his fingers, while the younger one, with a quick grin that seemed out of place in the aftermath, was limping from a graze on his calf. They'd fought for her, strangers who owed her nothing, and that stirred something in her, a mix of gratitude and suspicion she couldn't quite unravel. "Fine," she said, lowering the rifle but keeping her stance firm. "You want to help, start by not bleeding all over my porch. Inside, all of you. We'll patch you up, but don't think this makes us square." Jem's mouth quirked again, this time with a hint of a smile that made Clara's stomach do an irritating flip. "Yes, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat, and the gesture was so infuriatingly charming, she almost forgot the chaos he'd brought. Inside, a tense sort of order took hold. Eliza, ever the practical one, set to boiling water and tearing strips of clean cloth for bandages, while Clara directed Jem's men to the kitchen table. The cabin, small but sturdy, felt crowded with the 5 rough-hewn outlaws sprawled across it, their boots tracking dust and their low voices filling the air with a mix of curses and laughter. Red the burly one winced as Eliza cleaned his wound with a precision that brooked no nonsense while the young one introduced, as Tommy kept cracking jokes that earned him glares from his companions. "You ever think maybe we're in over our heads, Jem?" Tommy said, grinning as Clara dabbed at his grazed leg with a damp cloth. "I mean, we're fighting for a lady's cabbages now. That's a new low even for us." Clara shot him a look, her lips twitching despite herself. "Those cabbages were dinner, you rascal. You're lucky I don't make you replant every last one." Tommy's grin widened, but Jem cut in his voice low and firm. "Enough, Tommy. Miss Johnson's done more for us than we deserve. Show some respect." The room fell quiet, the weight of Jem's words settling over them. Clara glanced at him, caught off guard by the sincerity in his tone. He was sitting by the window, his injured leg propped on a stool, his revolver resting on the table beside him. His eyes, those piercing gray eyes, kept flicking to the door, as if expecting Rourke to burst through at any moment. There was a tension in him, a coiled readiness that made Clara realize he wasn't just a man on the run. He was a man at war with stakes she couldn't yet grasp. As she worked bandaging Tommy's leg, an awkward silence, stretch broken only by the clink of Eliza's kettle and Red's occasional grunts of pain. Clara's hands moved with practiced ease, but her mind was racing. These men with their scars and their secrets had risked their lives for her and her mother. Why loyalty to Jem, sure, but there was something else, something unspoken that hung in the air like smoke. She stole a glance at Jem, who was watching her now, his expression unreadable but intense, and she felt that same irritating flip in her stomach. Trying to lighten the mood, she cleared her throat. "So, Jem, you and your boys always ride into shootouts for strangers, or did I just get lucky?" The question caught him off guard, and for a moment his guard dropped, a sheepish grin breaking through. "Reckon you're a special case, Clara. Ain't every day a lady pulls me out of a gully and then stares down a gang without blinking." Red snorted, his deep voice rumbling. "She's got more spine than half the men I know." "You sure you ain't part outlaw?" Miss Clara laughed, a sound that felt foreign in the tense air. "If I was, I'd have better aim than you lot. Half your bullets hit my barn instead of Rourke's men." The men chuckled, even Jem, and the tension eased, if only for a moment. But the levity was short-lived. A sharp knock at the door sent everyone's hands to their weapons, and Clara's heart leaped to her throat. Jem was on his feet in an instant, his limp forgotten, his revolver in hand. He motioned for silence, his eyes narrowing as he approached the door. "Who's there?" he called, his voice low and dangerous. A muffled voice answered, hesitant but familiar. "It's Amos from the Miller place. Got a message for Miss Johnson." Clara frowned, exchanging a glance with her mother. Amos was a neighbor, a grizzled old rancher who kept to himself. Why would he come now, with night falling and trouble so fresh? Jem cracked the door, his gun still raised, and peered out. Satisfied, he stepped aside, letting Amos in. The old man looked shaken, his hat clutched in his hands, his eyes darting nervously. "Clara, Eliza," he said, nodding to them. "I heard the gunfire from my place. Figured you'd want to know Rourke's been seen at the old canyon camp not 10 miles from here. He's got more men and they're planning something. Word is they're coming back for you. And for that gold they keep yammering about." Clara's blood ran cold, and she felt Jem's gaze on her, heavy with unspoken promises. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in, as the reality of Rourke's return sank in. Her home, her mother, her life, they were all in the crosshairs, now caught in a fight she hadn't chosen. Jem stepped forward, his voice steady but laced with steel. "They won't touch this place, Amos. You tell anyone who'll listen. Clara Johnson's under our protection now. Rourke wants a fight, he'll get one." Amos nodded, his eyes flickering with something like awe, and shuffled out, leaving the cabin in a charged silence. Clara turned to Jem, her voice low but fierce. "You don't get to decide what happens to my home, Slade. I'm not some damsel waiting for your rescue. Jem met her gaze unflinching. I know you're not Clara, but you saved my life and I don't take debts lightly. You're in this because of me, and I'll see it through. The words hung between them heavy with meaning, and Clara felt that spark again, that dangerous pull that made her want to trust him, even as every instinct screamed to keep her guard up. The homestead was a battlefield now, and the fight was far from over. But as she looked at Jem, at the men who'd bled for her, she knew one thing for certain: whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. The air in the Johnson homestead was thick with tension, the kind that pressed against the walls and made every creak of the floorboards sound like a warning. Clara Mae Johnson stood in the flickering light of the oil lamp, her hands still smudged with dirt from the day's chaos, her eyes locked on Jeremiah Slade. His words promising protection, claiming a debt, hung between them like a taut rope pulling her toward him, even as her instincts screamed to hold her ground. The cabin was quiet now, save for the low murmurs of Jem's gang as they cleaned their weapons and tended their wounds. Eliza had retired to her room, her face pale, but resolute, leaving Clara to face the storm of emotions swirling in her chest. Outside, the night was a vast, inky expanse hiding the threat of Caleb Rourke and his men who were gathering at the canyon camp, plotting their return. Jem leaned against the kitchen table, his injured legs stretched out, his revolver now holstered, but within easy reach. His gray eyes sharp and searching followed Clara as she moved to the sink, rinsing her hands with deliberate care. The silence between them was charged not with anger, but with something unspoken, something that had sparked the moment she'd pulled him from that gully. She could feel his gaze warm and heavy, and it stirred a heat in her that she didn't want to name. This was no time for such feelings, not with danger circling her home like a pack of wolves, but the heart she was learning didn't always heed reason. You don't have to stand watch all night, Clara said, breaking the silence as she dried her hands on a rag. Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor beneath it, a crack in her usual armor. Your men look like they could use you more than I do. Jem's lips curved, not quite a smile, but close enough to make her pulse quicken. My men can handle themselves, he said, his voice low, roughened by the day's fight. It's you I'm worried about, Clara. Rourke's not the kind to let a slight go unanswered, and you've got his attention now. She turned to face him, leaning against the sink, her arms crossed to keep her hands from fidgeting. And whose fault is that Jem I didn't ask to be dragged into your mess? Her words were sharp, but there was no venom in them, only a raw honesty that made the air between them hum. He pushed off the table, taking a step toward her, his limp barely noticeable now. You're right, he said, his voice softer, almost intimate. You didn't ask for any of this. But you saved me, Clara, when you could have ridden on. That's not something I forget. The space between them shrank, the lamplight casting shadows that danced across his face, highlighting the sharp lines of his jaw, the faint stubble that darkened his cheeks. Clara's breath caught, and she cursed herself for it. She wasn't some starry-eyed girl swooning over a cowboy's charm, but there was something about Jem, his quiet strength, the way he looked at her, like she was the only thing in the room, that made her feel unsteady, exposed. Don't go thinking you owe me anything. She said, her voice quieter now, almost a whisper. I'd have done the same for anyone stuck in that gully. He took another step, close enough now that she could smell the leather of his coat, the faint tang of sweat and gunpowder clinging to him. Maybe, he said, his eyes locked on hers, but it wasn't just anyone. It was me. And I'm not the kind of man who lets a debt like that go unpaid. The words hung there, heavy with meaning, and Clara felt a flush creep up her neck. She should have stepped back, put distance between them, but her feet stayed rooted her body, betraying her with a pull she couldn't ignore. Jem's gaze dropped to her lips for a fleeting moment, and the air seemed to thicken, charged with a current that made her skin prickle. It was reckless, foolish even to let this moment linger, but the West had a way of stripping away pretenses, leaving only raw truths. Careful, Cowboy, she said, her voice low, teasing but with an edge of challenge. You keep talking like that, I might think you're sweet on me. Jem's mouth twitched, that almost smile breaking through again, and he leaned in just a fraction, his voice a husky murmur. "And what if I am Clara May? You gonna run me off with that rifle of yours?" Her heart thudded loud enough she was sure he could hear it. The room felt smaller, the world narrowing to the space between them, the heat of his breath, the intensity in his eyes. She could have laughed it off, turned away, but something in her, maybe the same stubborn courage that had made her climb down that gully, kept her there, meeting his gaze with her own fire. Before she could answer, a loud cough broke the spell. Tommy, the young outlaw with the quick grin, was leaning in the doorway, his bandaged leg propped against the wall. "Well, ain't this cozy?" he said, his tone dripping with mischief. "Here I thought we were hiding from Rourke, not sparking under the moonlight." Clara stepped back, her face burning, and shot Tommy a glare that could have scorched the floorboards. "You got a knack for bad timing, don't you?" Tommy grinned unrepentant. "Just keeping things lively, miss. Jem, you want us to set up a watch rotation, or you're planning to woo the lady all night?" Jem's expression hardened, but there was a flush on his cheeks that Clara didn't miss. "Get to it, Tommy," he said, his voice gruff. "2 on watch, 2-hour shifts, and keep your mouth shut for once." Tommy saluted with a mock flourish and sauntered out, leaving Clara and Jem alone again, the moment shattered but not forgotten. Clara busied herself with straightening the cloth on the table, her hands needing something to do to keep her thoughts from wandering. Jem watched her, his silence heavier now, as if he too felt the weight of what had almost happened. "We should get some rest," she said finally, her voice brisk, trying to reclaim her composure. "If Rourke's coming, we'll need our strength." Jem nodded, but he didn't move, his eyes still on her, searching. "Clara," he said, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. "I meant what I said. I'm here because of you, and not just because of that gully. You're different, stronger than most men I know, and kinder than this land deserves." The words hit her harder than she expected, stirring that warmth again, but she pushed it down. This wasn't the time, not with her home under threat and a gang of outlaws in her kitchen. "Save your sweet talk for when we're not dodging bullets," she said, but her tone was softer, betraying the flutter in her chest. "Go check on your men, Jem. I'll be fine." He hesitated, as if wanting to say more, then nodded and limped toward the door, pausing to glance back. "Get some sleep, Clara. I'll keep watch." As he stepped outside, joining his men in the cool night air, Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her skin still tingled where his gaze had lingered, and she cursed herself for letting him get under her skin. She wasn't naive. She knew the pull between them was real, a spark that could ignite something dangerous if she let it. But the West was no place for reckless hearts, and she had a home to protect, a mother to keep safe, in a fight that was only beginning. She moved to the window, peering out at the dark shapes of Jem and his men as they set up their watch. The night was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that hid danger like a snake coiled in the grass. Rourke was out there, and with him, the promise of more violence. But as Clara watched Jem, his silhouette strong against the starlit sky, she felt a strange certainty settle in her bones. Whatever came next, she'd face it with the same courage that had brought her to this moment, and maybe, just maybe with Jem by her side, that courage would be enough. The night stretched over Dustwater Valley like a heavy blanket, the stars sharp pinpricks in the vast darkness, offering no comfort to Clara May Johnson as she stood by the window of her homestead. The memory of Jem's words, his intense gray eyes, and the charged moment they'd shared lingered like a fever. But she pushed it aside, focusing on the silhouettes of Jem and his men outside. Their low voices carried faintly through the cracked window, organizing the watch rotation, with a quiet efficiency that spoke of experience. Clara's heart was still racing, not just from the nearness of Jem, but from the looming threat of Caleb Rourke, and his men camped not 10 miles away, plotting their revenge. The homestead, her sanctuary, felt like a fragile fortress, now its walls no match for the storm gathering on the horizon. She turned from the window, her hands restless, and busied herself checking the rifle, though it was already loaded and ready. Sleep was out of the question, not with danger so close. So Clara slipped into the kitchen where the faint glow of the oil lamp cast long shadows. Her mother Eliza was asleep or pretending to be leaving Clara alone with her thoughts. She sat at the table, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood, trying to piece together the puzzle of Jem Slade. A cowboy, an outlaw, a man with secrets heavy enough to draw blood. The gold Rourke wanted the debt Jem felt he owed her. It all swirled in her mind, a tangle of questions with no clear answers. She wanted to trust him, wanted to believe the sincerity in his voice, but the West had taught her that trust was a luxury often paid for in pain. A soft creak from the porch snapped her out of her thoughts, and she was on her feet in an instant, rifle in hand. The door eased open and Jem stepped inside, his hat in one hand, his face etched with fatigue but alert. "It's just me," he said quickly, raising a hand to calm her. "Didn't mean to startle you." Clara lowered the rifle, her pulse still hammering. "You move too quiet for a man with a limp," she said, her tone sharper than she intended. "What's wrong, Rourke's men?" Jem shook his head, closing the door softly behind him. "Not yet. The boys are keeping watch, but I needed to talk to you. Alone." His voice was low, urgent, and there was something new in his eyes, a flicker of unease that made Clara's stomach tighten. She set the rifle against the wall, crossing her arms. "You've got my attention, Jem. Start talking. What's this gold Rourke's after, and why is it worth burning my home to the ground?" He hesitated, glancing toward the window as if to ensure no one was listening, then stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "It's not what you think, Clara. The gold, it ain't bars or coins. It's a map, a ledger hidden in a tin box I buried out in the hills. It points to a vein, a big one, that Rourke's boss wants to claim. But it's not just about money. That land's sacred to the folks who've lived here longer than any of us. Rourke's boss, a man named Hargrove, means to strip it bare no matter who it hurts." Clara's breath caught, her mind racing to process his words. A map, sacred land, a man named Hargrove. It was a bigger story than she'd imagined, one that reached beyond her homestead, beyond even Dustwater Valley. "And you've got this map?" she asked, her voice steady despite the shock. "Why not destroy it?" Jem's jaw tightened and he looked away, his fingers clenching the brim of his hat. "Because it's not just a map. It's proof of what Hargrove's done to get his hands on that land. Murders, burned villages, families driven off. I took it from him, Clara, not for greed, but to stop him, to give it to someone who can use it to bring him down." The weight of his words settled over her, heavy and cold. This wasn't just a feud between outlaws, it was a war one, with stakes that stretched far beyond her small world. But before she could press further, a sharp whistle pierced the night, followed by the sound of boots pounding across the yard. Jem's hand went to his revolver, and Clara grabbed her rifle, her heart leaping to her throat. "It's Tommy," Jem said, already moving toward the door. "Trouble?" They stepped onto the porch where Tommy was waiting, his usual grin replaced by a grim urgency. "Riders, Jem," he said, his voice low. "Not Rourke's men. Someone else. Coming from the west, moving fast." Clara's blood ran cold. Someone else. The west was full of dangers, but the timing felt too precise, too deliberate. She followed Jem and Tommy to the edge of the yard, where Red and the others were already crouched behind the fence, their weapons ready. The night was dark, the moon a thin crescent, but she could make out the shapes of riders, 5, maybe 6 approaching, with a purpose that sent a chill down her spine. Jem signaled for silence, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Stay low," he whispered to Clara, his hand brushing her arm, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt through her despite the danger. She nodded, her rifle steady, her focus sharp. The riders slowed as they neared the homestead, their horses snorting softly in the quiet. The leader, a tall figure in a long coat, raised a hand and the other stopped. "Clara Johnson," the man called, his voice clear, almost formal, cutting through the night. "We mean no harm. We're here for Slade." Clara's heart stuttered. Not Rourke, not Hargrove's men, but someone who knew Jem, someone who knew her name. She glanced at Jem, whose face had gone pale, his eyes wide with something she hadn't seen in him before: fear. "Who are you?" Clara called back, her voice steady, despite the uncertainty clawing at her. "And what do you want with him?" The leader dismounted, his movements slow, deliberate, as if to show he wasn't a threat. But the glint of a badge on his chest caught the faint moonlight, and Clara's stomach dropped. A lawman. A U.S. Marshal by the look of it, and not the kind you could bribe or scare off. "Name's Marshal Ethan Cole," the man said, stepping forward, his hands raised but his posture commanding. "Slade's wanted for theft and murder, among other things. Hand him over, Miss Johnson, and we'll leave your home in peace." Clara's breath caught her eyes, snapping to Jem. Murder, theft. The man she'd saved, the man who'd fought for her, who'd looked at her with such intensity, was he a killer? Her mind reeled, the pieces of his story clashing with this new revelation. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust the man who'd stood between her and Rourke's guns, but the badge in front of her was real, and so was the weight of the law. Jem's hand tightened on his revolver, but he didn't draw. "Clara," he said, his voice low, urgent, meant only for her. "It's not what it seems. I swear it. Hargrove's got men in high places, and that badge don't mean what you think." The marshal's eyes narrowed, catching Jem's movement. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Slade. You've got nowhere to run." Clara's heart pounded, her rifle still raised, her mind torn between loyalty to the man who'd saved her home and the lawman's authority. Jem's gang was tense, their weapons ready, but they waited for her lead, their trust in her a heavy burden. The night seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with the promise of violence. "Clara," Jem said again, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "Trust me, just this once." She looked into his eyes, those gray eyes that had haunted her since the gully, and saw something raw, something desperate. Not the eyes of a killer, but of a man fighting for more than his own life. Her grip on the rifle tightened, and in that moment, she made her choice. "Marshal," she said, her voice ringing clear in the night, "you're on my land, and I don't take kindly to demands. Jem's staying right here until I hear the whole story. You want him, you'll have to go through me." The words hung in the air, a challenge that shocked even her. Jem's gang shifted, their loyalty to her solidified, and Jem's eyes softened with something like awe. The marshal's face hardened, but before he could respond, a distant shout echoed from the canyon, a war cry raw and wild. Rourke's men closing in, drawn by the standoff like vultures to a kill. The twist was complete. Clara, a woman who'd only wanted to protect her home, was now standing between a lawman's badge and an outlaw's promise, with a gang of killers bearing down. The West had a way of turning simple acts of kindness into battles for survival, and Clara Mae Johnson was about to learn just how deep those battles could cut. The night air over Dustwater Valley crackled with tension, as if the stars themselves were holding their breath. Clara Mae Johnson stood firm on her homestead's porch, her rifle steady in her hands, her heart pounding like a war drum. Her words, defiant, unwavering, still echoed in the stillness, a bold line drawn in the dirt between Marshal Ethan Cole's badge and Jeremiah Slade's shadowed past. Jem stood beside her, his revolver at the ready, his gray eyes flickering with a mix of gratitude and urgency. His gang, scattered behind the fence, held their positions, their loyalty to Clara now as solid as the earth beneath their boots. But the distant war cry from the canyon, raw and menacing, signaled Caleb Rourke's men closing in, turning a tense standoff into a powder keg ready to blow. Clara's choice to protect Jem had thrust her into a storm where law, loyalty, and vengeance collided, and there was no turning back. Marshal Cole's face was a mask of frustration, his hands still raised but his eyes darting toward the canyon's dark silhouette. "You're making a mistake, Miss Johnson," he said, his voice tight, carrying the weight of authority tested by defiance. "Slade's a wanted man, and shielding him makes you an accomplice. You want your home burned by outlaws, or hauled off in chains by the law. Clara's jaw clenched, but her resolve didn't waver. "I don't take kindly to threats, Marshal," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the night. "You want Jim, you'll have to explain why a man like him's got more honor in his eyes than the lot of you chasing him, and if Rourke's coming, you'd best decide whose side you're on." The Marshal's men shifted, their hands twitching near their holsters, but Cole raised a hand to still them. His gaze flicked to Jem, then back to Clara, assessing her with a grudging respect. "You've got spine, I'll give you that," he said. "But you're betting on the wrong horse." Before Clara could respond, Tommy, the young outlaw with the irrepressible grin, piped up from behind the fence, his voice carrying a cheeky edge. "Wrong horse, hell, Marshal. Miss Clara's got us all saddled up and ready to ride." "You sure you want to tangle with her?" The comment drew a nervous chuckle from Red, the burly, red-bearded outlaw who was still nursing his wounded arm. Even Jem's lips twitched, though his eyes never left the Marshal. Clara shot Tommy a glare, half amused, half exasperated. "Tommy, you picked the worst times to run your mouth," she said, but the humor in her voice eased the tension, if only for a heartbeat. The moment shattered as another shout echoed from the canyon closer, now followed by the unmistakable thunder of hooves. Rourke's men weren't just coming, they were charging, their silhouettes emerging from the darkness, like specters of vengeance. Clara's heart lurched and she tightened her grip on the rifle, her mind racing. The Marshal's men spun, drawing their weapons, their focus torn between Jem's gang and the new threat. The homestead, already battered from the earlier fight, was now a battlefield caught between three forces: the law, Jem's outlaws, and Rourke's bloodthirsty crew. Jem stepped closer to Clara, his voice low and urgent. "Clara, get your mother inside. This is about to get ugly." She bristled, her eyes flashing. "I'm not hiding, Jem. This is my home, and I'll fight for it same as you." But even as she spoke, she glanced at the cabin where Eliza's frail form was surely listening, her heart heavy with worry. The thought of her mother caught in the crossfire softened Clara's stubbornness, but only slightly. Jem's hand grazed her arm, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt through her, rekindling the spark from their earlier moment in the kitchen. "I know you're no coward," he said, his voice softer now, almost intimate. "But I need you alive, Clara. For your ma. For me." The words hit her like a gust of wind, stealing her breath. She wanted to snap back to keep her walls up, but the raw sincerity in his eyes made her falter. Before she could respond, the Marshal's voice cut through, sharp and commanding. "Slade, if you've got any sense, you'll stand down and let us handle Rourke. We can end this clean." Jem's laugh was bitter, his hand tightening on his revolver. "Clean. You think Hargrove's got you on a leash for Justice, Cole. He's the one pulling Rourke's strings, and you're too blind to see it." The accusation hung in the air, and Clara's mind spun. Hargrove, the name Jem, had mentioned the man behind the gold, the map, the sacred land. Was the Marshal part of it too? The pieces were falling together, but the puzzle was far from complete, and there was no time to think. The hoofbeats were louder now, Rourke's men close enough that Clara could see the glint of their weapons in the moonlight. "Enough talk," Red bellowed, his deep voice booming as he raised his rifle. "They're here." The first shot rang out a crack that split the night, and chaos erupted. Rourke's men charged into the homestead's yard, firing wildly, their bullets tearing into the fence and splintering the porch. Jem's gang returned fire, their shots precise and deadly, while the Marshal's men scrambled for cover, caught in the crossfire. Clara dropped to a crouch, her rifle raised, and fired at a shadow that moved too close to the barn. The man fell with a cry, and she swallowed the bile rising in her throat. She'd shot to wound, not kill, but the line between the two was thin in the heat of battle. Jem was a whirlwind, his revolver blazing, as he took down one of Rourke's men with a shot to the shoulder. He moved with a grace that belied his injured leg, his focus absolute, but Clara saw the strain in his face, the weight of leading his men into this fight. She caught his eye for a moment, and he nodded a silent promise that they'd get through this. The marshal, to his credit, didn't hesitate. Whatever his motives, he and his men joined the fray, their gunfire adding to the cacophony. Clara saw Cole take aim at a rider charging toward the house, dropping him with a clean shot. For a moment it seemed they might hold the line, but Rourke's voice roared over the chaos, chilling in its clarity. "Burn it," he shouted, and Clara's heart stopped as she saw a flicker of flame, a torch tossed toward the barn. The dry wood caught, fast orange tongues licking up the walls, and panic surged through her. The barn held their tools, their feed, their hope for surviving the winter. If it went, so did their future. "No," Clara shouted, breaking from the porch and sprinting toward the barn, her rifle forgotten in her desperation. Jem called after her, his voice raw, but she didn't stop. She grabbed a bucket from the well, her hands shaking as she filled it, the heat of the flames already stinging her face. "Clara, get back." Jem was at her side, yanking her away as another torch flew this one landing in the garden. The dry stalks caught, and the fire spread, a cruel mockery of the life she'd fought to nurture. Tears stung her eyes, not from fear, but from rage, from the injustice of it all. Tommy appeared dragging a hose from the pump, his usual grin replaced by a fierce determination. "Ain't letting your cabbages go that easy, miss," he yelled, spraying water at the garden flames. The absurdity of his words in the midst of battle drew a choked laugh from Clara, even as she hauled another bucket toward the barn. The fight raged on, a chaotic dance of gunfire shouts and the roar of flames. Rourke's men were relentless, but Jem's gang and the marshal's men held their ground, their combined firepower, pushing the attackers back. Clara worked alongside Tommy, dousing the flames as best she could, her arms aching, her lungs burning. Jem stayed close, his revolver never far, his eyes darting between her and the fight. As the flames in the garden died down, Clara caught sight of Rourke himself, his scarred face illuminated by the firelight, his pistol aimed at Jem. Time seemed to slow as she shouted a warning, her voice lost in the chaos. Jem spun, but Rourke fired the bullet, grazing his shoulder, sending him staggering. Clara's heart lurched, and she dropped the bucket, running to him without thinking. "Jem," she cried, catching him as he stumbled. Blood seeped through his shirt, but his eyes were clear, his jaw set. "I'm fine," he growled, pushing her behind him as he raised his revolver. "Stay down, Clara." But she didn't. She grabbed her rifle from the ground, her hands steady despite the chaos, and stood beside him, her gaze locked on Rourke. The outlaw's smile was a twisted thing, promising more pain. But before he could fire again, a shot rang out from the marshal's direction, and Rourke fell clutching his leg. The tide turned Rourke's men faltering without their leader. Some fled into the night, others fell to the combined might of Jem's gang and the marshal's men. The flames in the barn were under control, thanks to Tommy's quick thinking, but the homestead was scarred, the air heavy with smoke and the weight of what had been lost. As the gunfire faded, Clara stood panting, her rifle still in hand, Jem's arm brushing hers. The marshal approached, his face grim, but his badge gleaming. "This ain't over, Slade," he said, but his tone lacked the earlier venom. "You and I will settle up, but not tonight." Clara looked at Jem, his shoulder bleeding, his face pale but resolute. The fight had cost them dearly, but they'd held the line together. And as she met his eyes, she knew the hardest battles were still to come, not just with Rourke or the law, but with the truth that lay between them, a truth that could either save them or tear them apart. The smoke hung heavy over the Johnson homestead, curling into the pre-dawn sky, like a ghost reluctant to leave. The flames that had threatened the barn and garden were gone, reduced to smoldering embers, but the scars they left behind marked the earth in Clara Mae Johnson's heart. She stood in the yard, her rifle still in hand, her brown hair loose and tangled, her eyes burning with exhaustion and defiance. Beside her, Jeremiah Slade leaned against a fence post, his shoulder bandaged with a strip of cloth torn from Tommy's shirt, his gray eyes scanning the horizon where Caleb Rourke's men had fled. The Marshal Ethan Cole stood a few paces away, his badge glinting faintly as the first light of dawn crept over Dustwater Valley. The battle was over, but the air still thrummed with the weight of what had passed and what was yet to come. Clara's mother, Eliza, emerged from the cabin, her frail frame wrapped in a shawl, her face pale but resolute. She took in the scene, the battered homestead, the weary men, her daughter standing tall amidst the chaos, and her eyes softened with pride. "Clara May," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "You've got your father's heart, and then some." Clara managed a tired smile, stepping to her mother's side and squeezing her hand. "We're still standing, Ma. That's what counts." But her gaze drifted to Jem, whose silence spoke louder than words. The Marshal's accusation, murder theft, still hung between them, a shadow that refused to lift. She needed answers, and she needed them now. Jem caught her look, his expression unreadable, but heavy with something unspoken. He pushed off the fence, wincing as his wounded shoulder protested and faced Marshal Cole. "You want your truth, Cole? Let's have it out. But not here, not in front of her." He nodded toward Clara, his voice low but firm. "She's been through enough." Clara's temper flared, her exhaustion giving way to frustration. "Don't you dare decide what I can handle, Jem Slade," she snapped, stepping between him and the Marshal. "My home's been shot up, my garden's ash, and I've got a right to know why. You talk about a map, sacred land, some man named Hargrove. Now you tell me the rest, or I'll hand you to the Marshal myself." Tommy, leaning against the barn with his bandaged leg, let out a low whistle. "She don't bluff, Jem. Better start talking before she reloads that rifle." The faint chuckle from Red and the other outlaws eased the tension, but only slightly. Jem's eyes softened as he looked at Clara, and for a moment she saw the man from the gully again, vulnerable, grateful, carrying a burden too heavy for one soul. He took a deep breath, his voice steady, but laced with pain. "All right, Clara, you deserve the truth, all of it." He told her everything, his words spilling out like water from a cracked dam. The map wasn't just a guide to gold. It was a ledger of Hargrove's crimes, a record of land-stolen lives taken and promises broken. Jem had been part of Hargrove's outfit once a young man, drawn by the promise of quick money, but he turned against his boss when he saw the cost, entire communities driven from their homes, sacred sites desecrated for profit. He'd stolen the ledger not for wealth, but to expose Hargrove, to give the displaced a chance at justice. The murder charge, a lie pinned on him by Hargrove's influence, a way to silence him. The gold was a myth, a lure to keep Rourke and his men chasing him, while the real treasure was the truth buried in that tin box. Clara listened, her heart torn between disbelief and a growing certainty that Jem was telling the truth. His voice, raw and honest, carried the weight of a man who'd seen too much but refused to break. When he finished, the yard was silent, the dawn light casting long shadows across the battered homestead. Marshal Cole, who listened without interruption, shifted his weight, his face a mix of skepticism and reluctant respect. "That's a hell of a story, Slade," he said, his voice gruff. "But a story ain't proof. You got that ledger?" Jem nodded, his hand resting on his coat pocket. "Buried out in the hills. I can take you to it, but only if you swear to use it against Hargrove, not me." Cole's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Clara stepped forward, and her voice cutting through the tension. "If that ledger's real, Marshal, you'll see it. But you're not taking Jem until I know you're not in Hargrove's pocket. I've seen enough of men like him to know money buys badges as easy as it buys guns." The Marshal's jaw tightened, but a flicker of amusement crossed his face. "You're a hard woman to argue with, Miss Johnson. All right, we'll ride to that ledger, but Slade's under my watch until we sort this out." Clara nodded, satisfied for now, and turned to Jem. "You'd better not be lying," she said, her tone softer but still fierce. "Because I've staked a lot on you, Cowboy." Jem's smile was small but genuine, his eyes warm with something that made her heart skip. "I'm not lying, Clara. Not to you." The next hours were a blur of action. Jem led the marshal and his men to the hills, Clara riding alongside her rifle slung across her back. The ledger was where Jem said it would be buried beneath a gnarled oak, its pages brittle but damning. Cole read it in silence, his face darkening with every line. And when he looked up, there was a new resolve in his eyes. "This goes to the governor," he said. "Hargrove's finished. Rourke, wounded and abandoned by his men, was taken into custody, his threats empty now that his master's secrets were exposed. Jem's gang, battered but loyal, agreed to testify their own crimes, overshadowed by the greater good. The homestead, though scarred, stood as a testament to Clara's courage, and as the marshal prepared to leave, he tipped his hat to her. "You ever think of wearing a badge, Miss Johnson?" he asked, half serious. Clara laughed, the sound bright in the morning air. "I've got enough trouble without one, Marshal." As the lawmen rode off, Jem stayed behind his horse, tethered near Juniper. The gang had scattered to tend their wounds and plan their next move, leaving Clara and Jem alone in the yard. The silence between them was different now, not tense, but full, heavy with possibility. "You don't have to stay," Clara said, her voice soft as she looked at him, the dawn light catching the flecks of gold in her eyes. "You're free now. No more running." Jem stepped closer, his hand brushing hers, a touch that sent warmth through her, despite the cool morning air. "Maybe I'm not running anymore," he said, his voice low, steady. "Maybe I've found something worth staying for." Her breath caught, and for once, she didn't fight the pull between them. She let her hand linger in his, her heart open to the risk, to the chance of something new. "You're trouble, Jem Slade," she said, a smile tugging at her lips. "But I reckon I can handle a little trouble." He grinned, the first real smile she'd seen, and it lit up his face, chasing away the shadows. "Good," he said, "because I ain't going anywhere." The days that followed were filled with rebuilding the barn, patched the garden, replanted the homestead, slowly coming back to life. Jem stayed, his hands as steady with a hammer as they were with a revolver, his presence a quiet strength beside Clara. Eliza watched them with a knowing smile, her health frail, but her spirit buoyed by the hope of new beginnings. The ledger reached the governor, and Hargrove's empire began to crumble, his name, a curse whispered in saloons and courtrooms. Dustwater Valley, once a place of secrets and strife, settled into a fragile peace, its people bound by the courage of a woman who dared to save a stranger and the man who'd fought to repay her kindness. Clara and Jem stood together one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of amber and crimson, the same colors that had marked their first meeting. The West was still wild, still unforgiving, but in that moment, it was theirs, a land where a single act of compassion had forged a bond stronger than any storm. And as Clara leaned into Jem's side, his arm warm around her, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they'd face them together, their hearts as unyielding as the valley itself. If you find it interesting, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment. Thank you very much.